Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. This episode is about the tragedy of the commons, or as we'll talk about, what could perhaps better be described as the tragedies of open access. Tragedies because there are two, not just one, and open access because that's a better description than the commons of the situations where these tragedies occur. Back in 1968, a man named Garrett Hardin published an article in the journal Science called The Tragedy of the Commons that got this into the popular discourse about environmental problems. And as an example of what he was talking about, Hardin used a pasture in which people are running cattle, grazing their cattle, that's open to all. Everybody can run their cattle on it. And he said that if that's the case, individuals who are making the so-called rational choice about whether or not to add another animal to the pasture will weigh up the benefit to them of having that extra animal on the pasture versus the cost to them alone. The cost to them alone is that having that extra animal will deplete to some extent the amount of fodder there for other animals to graze upon. But most of the other animals aren't theirs. They're other people's animals. Most of the cost of adding an extra animal to the herd falls on others, not on the individual. So in weighing up the costs and the benefits, the individual, so-called rational individual, taking into account only of the cost to the individual, will decide, yeah, I'll go ahead and put another animal on the pasture. And everybody else decides the same thing. And they keep doing that, and at the end of the day, there's so many animals on the pasture that the grazing lands get depleted. Here's how Hardin summed up the tragedy of the commons. He said, picture a pasture open to all. It's expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Ruin, Hardin says, is the destination toward which men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. Hardin gave a few other examples of this tragedy of the commons, as he called it as well. He used the example of parking congestion, where if people are free to park wherever they want, you can get into a mess where nobody can even get their car out of the lot. He used the example of overcrowding in national parks, where the national parks would be overrun by people coming in to look at the natural wonders there. He used the example of pollution, where the air is a commons, and the pollution pumped into the air gradually poisons us all. And he used the example of human population growth. In fact, that was Hardin's main aim in his article, was to call attention to what he saw as the perils of human population growth and overpopulation. In that case, humans are the animals being put onto the pasture, the planet. And to deal with these tragedies of the commons, Hardin proposed two possible remedies, two ways of dealing with the problem. One was private property. Privatize the commons. In the case of the cattle pasture, divided up into individual pastures. Each person with cattle has their own patch. And then, when they're weighing up whether or not to put another animal on the pasture, all the costs are internal to them rather than being spread more widely. That's the privatization solution. And the other solution, Hardin said, was the state getting involved, the state controlling the situation, managing these commons for the benefit of the society. And in the case of population, that's what Hardin was talking about. He was talking about the state controlling how many children people should bear in the interests of preventing the tragedy of the commons. Both these solutions were discussed in his article, and different solutions might best fit different contexts in his mind. Hardin was missing a few pieces, however, and I want to spend a moment talking with you about them. With respect to human population, one of the missing pieces had to do with the importance of reproductive rights and the possibility that people would voluntarily limit their fertility and that society would undergo what demographers call a demographic transition towards a situation where the population is no longer growing. A second thing that Hardin missed was the difference between commons, real-world commons, as they exist around the world and have existed for centuries, and open access, access open to all, as he put it. And the third is the second tragedy of open access, the fact that apart from the abuse of nature, there's abuse of other people that happens in the tragedy. Let me tell you a little bit about each of those. In the case of population growth, what Hardin failed to anticipate, like Malthus before him failed to anticipate almost 200 years earlier, was the possibility that as human societies develop, as incomes grow, as livelihoods improve, and in particular as the position of women improves, as their employment opportunities improve, for example, as their access to birth control improves, people would voluntarily decide to limit their fertility in ways that would ultimately lead to the population stabilizing as opposed to continuing to grow exponentially. And that is exactly what's been happening ever since Hardin wrote his article about half a century ago. Fertility rates have been declining around the world, and in some countries we're even below what demographers call replacement level fertility, where the number of people being born is enough to outweigh the number of people dying. In those societies, people are talking about how to raise population rather than how to shrink it. And so this is a key thing that Hardin didn't really factor into his discussion of population. And the key elements in driving the demographic transition forward, driving those birth rate declines, turns out to be, above all, falling infant mortality, so that when people have children, they're pretty confident they're going to survive to adulthood, and improvements in the position of women, coupled with access to birth control, coupled with reproductive rights. You put those things together, it turns out you don't need the state to tell people how many children to have. You can leave that up to people to decide for themselves. And many of us would argue that that is something that really people should decide for themselves and shouldn't be decided for them by somebody else. Second thing Hardin missed was the difference between commons and open access. Turns out around the world there are lots of commons, grazing lands, water systems, fisheries, forests, that are managed by communities as what's called common property. They belong to the community as a whole, but the community has the ability to exclude others from using those resources and sets up its own rules for managing the resources so as to protect them and be able to use them sustainably. Elinor Ostrom, whose picture is shown down here, won the Nobel Prize for her work in documenting the success of common property management around the world and for looking into the preconditions for successful commons management. So what Hardin was really talking about wasn't common property, the commons as we know it. He was talking about an absence of any property rights. That's what open access is. No property rights, a free-for-all. Anybody can come in and use and abuse the resource. The third thing Hardin missed was the second tragedy of open access. And that's the tragedy that comes from the fact that just because everybody in theory can abuse the resource doesn't mean everybody does, or everybody can in practice. In practice, those who deplete the fisheries, for example, are those with the technologies that are quote-unquote efficient enough and the incentive structure that leads them to be ruthless enough to scoop out everything they can out of that fishery and then move on somewhere else. And when they do that, it's the people who were using the fishery who didn't have those technologies and didn't have those incentives who suffer. So the fact that we're all equally able to use the commons or really the open access resource, when there are no property rights, doesn't actually mean we're all equal. It recalls the saying, the law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich and poor as well to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. It's a hollow form of equality. It also recalls the phrase in George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. When it comes to exploiting open access resources, we're all equal, but it turns out some are more equal than others. So what do we need to do to confront the dual tragedies of open access, the abuse of resources and the abuse of other people, as some exploit those open access resources to the detriment of others? Well, one thing we can conclude is that the search for solutions to those open access problems are not just a matter of people versus nature. They're a matter of some people versus other people. The many who are harmed by the abuse of open access resources against the few who benefit from overexploiting those resources, or at least benefit in the short term. And the second thing we can realize is that solutions to problems of open access invariably require the creation of property rights in some form. But property rights can take many forms, including not only private property and state property, but also common property and combinations of these. When the state regulates how private property owners can use their property, for example, that's modifying the property rights. So there's somewhere between pure private property and pure state property. And in practice, this is the way we actually address environmental problems. The French anarchist Proudhon once famously said back in 1840 that property is theft. But the moral of this story is that absence of property can be theft too. And if we want to deal with that problem, if we want to deal with environmental problems, we need to think seriously about the kinds of rights we want to construct to provide an alternative to open access. Thank you very much.